George Kilpatrick, Inspiration for the Nation, celebrating people we feel good about. We have been celebrating or commemorating Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And this is the last day. It's Halloween. Um, but we've got Chris Kosakowski. He's the campus project coordinator here to tell us a little bit about what they do on the campus and some other stuff that they do that we'll happily get engaged in. But Chris, good to see you. Good to talk to you. And Chris and I work together, so that's,
yes,
let's do all of that too in terms of full disclosure. But listen, Chris, let's tell the audience about what you do in supporting campuses in the area under the New York State Enough is Enough legislation.
Yeah, thanks for having me, George. It's always a pleasure. My name is Chris Kosakowski, he, him, his. I am our campus team coordinator. We run a dual program that does both prevention and advocacy for the college campuses. So there are 9 colleges in the Syracuse area that we are working with to provide a number of services. We do a lot in the prevention realm, talking to groups of students, whether it's RAs or athletes or Greek life, student groups, having really engaging conversations about healthy relationships, consent, boundaries, how to be an empowered bystander, really just trying to bring as much information, awareness, and skills to college students as we can, because they're at that age where they're growing and learning and having relationships, and being able to create a long-lasting impact during this time is really important. That's a big chunk of what we do for the campuses. But in addition to that, we also provide them with a lot of support. So under the advocacy umbrella of our work, we can work with students who are victims or survivors who have experienced these things to provide them with resources, direct support, crisis intervention. If they need to figure out how to report something like this, how to get support on their campus, how to reach out to law enforcement or their Title IX office, we can be with them every step of the way and figuring out for them what are their needs, what we can do to help support them in any way that they really need. So we do that with one-on-one advocacy or things like support groups and things like that.
And if you think about what we've been hearing in the news, a lot of the campuses, whether it's Syracuse or other campuses, we've seen a lot of issues on the campuses lately with some athletes, for example. There have been some issues, certainly.
Yeah, I think these are not new things. Any of these issues, I think they're always ongoing things that colleges unfortunately struggle with. I think that colleges do try really hard, but there are always going to be things that fall through the cracks. People are going to do things that are harmful. And I think that students are in a place now more than ever where they're being very vocal about these issues. They've, throughout the pandemic, we've seen how the rise of protests has really inspired college students to find their voice and speak up and speak truth to their experiences and work to hold colleges accountable for the environments in which they are learning and growing. And I think it's really powerful when groups of survivors can come together and really say, this is what we're experiencing, this is what we need from our campus. And part of my job is to help the campuses figure some of that stuff out and how they can make these changes and create a better environment for their students.
Yeah, and we saw a lot of social media activism and a lot of activism around social justice issues as well on campus, making campuses be true to what they say they're about in terms of a student-centered environment. And I know that is also some of the work that you're engaged in through Vera House around social justice issues. Say a little bit more about that and how that connects to the work of domestic violence and sexual violence awareness.
Yeah, I think we can't really talk about domestic and sexual violence and preventing it without talking about how other forms of oppression and violence and harm exist in our world. I think for too long, we've really separated those issues when really they are the same thing. So to elaborate on that, when we talk about domestic and sexual violence, we often talk about what are the causes of that? Why does a person do that? And oftentimes people have all these misconceptions of, a person's just stressed, or they have anger issues or substance abuse issues or a trauma history. And those are factors that can exist. But underneath all of that, the true reasons why a person is committing harm in a relationship is rooted in power and control. The belief that, like, I as an individual am entitled to power over my partner, that they're less than me, and I'm going to use tactics and behaviors to control their actions to get that power from them. Now, when we look at other forms of violence like racism, sexism, homophobia, all of these forms of oppression are also rooted in this same power and control dynamic, right? That as a group of people, I am more deserving of rights or opportunities or privileges and power over other groups of people. And I'm going to use tactics like discrimination or policies or hatred or violence to control them. So when we're talking about ending domestic and sexual violence, we're talking about disrupting power and control. Now, individuals have intersecting identities. We're not all just one thing. We have our race, we have our gender, we have our sexual orientation, we have our ability status. All of these things make up who we are. And we are intersectional beings. So we have to look at things intersectionally. So when we're talking about ending domestic and sexual violence, we often get trapped in this just focusing on the one issue when people are facing multiple issues at the same time. So if we want to get to the root causes of domestic violence that's under a patriarchal system, we have to talk about what's upholding that. And in our American culture, what is upholding all forms of oppression, whether it's, capitalism, racism, sexism, homophobia, all of that is rooted in white supremacy. So if we want to get to the really, really deep root causes and make long-lasting changes across all of these boards, we have to acknowledge how white supremacy impacts domestic and sexual violence work and work to address that. Our vision at Vera House is a world free of violence and abuse. And that doesn't just mean for some people, that means for all people in all ways.
Right. It's interesting you say that. It doesn't mean for some people, but for all people. And for the way you described power and control and how that shows up in, especially when you're talking about race and one race wanting to dominate and discriminate and minimize another group or other groups, if you will, whether those groups are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, or people of what we might call marginalized communities, sexual orientation, LGBTQIA, right? So there are a lot of connections here, but a lot of times, Chris, these connections aren't obvious and people don't see it. And so I like how you're connecting the dots there so people can see it very clearly.
And I think the work of preventing all of these things and changing systems, the same tactics that we then talk about in bystander intervention have to apply. So our goal is that people in communities in the world are able to step up as empowered bystanders, right? If they're seeing something that they don't agree with, that they're going to step up and do something about it. If you see someone at a bar feeding someone shots, intentionally getting them intoxicated to make them leave, we're wanting to have people step up and say, hey, that's not cool. We don't like that. That same bystander behavior needs to show up in, oh, I'm in a group chat with my friends and someone says something problematic, whether it's sexist, whether it's racist, whether it's whatever, that you can step up, challenge that behavior, call it out, address it, do something to support the people in your social circles that can work to end these issues from continuing.
So I know the Vera House is doing this idea of anti-racism and anti-oppression work. This is something that Vera House has made a commitment to, and doing that work internally as well, to look at its own practices and to see how some of these systems might even show up within the agency itself. Say more about that.
Yeah, I think with all systems, there's going to be flaws, right? And all systems have a history, all systems have people in them that are, existing and interacting. The entirety of the domestic and sexual violence field, if you really dig into the history, is rooted a lot in white feminism, that we have to be saviors to people, that we have to like have really harsh forms of punishment in a punitive model of when we're working with clients, we hear this all of the time of how systems have really held them down, and we have to acknowledge how that shows up for our clients and also for us as people doing the work, right? Vera House is a system. We are an agency that's existed for a long time, and we have people within it that are interacting with each other. So there are ways in which, as service providers, we have inadvertently or advertently not provided the same level of care for all of our clients across the board, especially clients of color. We have to acknowledge how we treat each other as staff, how folks of color within the agency have not always had the best experience with the hierarchy, with power and control, and how that shows up in the workforce. So what we've really been doing as an agency is beginning a conversation about that. I think the world has a lot of work to do and a long way to go, as do we. We're not perfect in this. We're not experts. We're dedicating ourselves to the cause, and that's going to cause some bumps along the way. It's going to cause some tension, some frustration, but we have to be unafraid to lean into that conflict and not stay status quo. That's going to look like people disagreeing. It's going to look like people leaving. It's going to look like our community perception shifting. But if we don't do this work well, there's no point in continuing to do anything at all, because at the end of the day, we know that clients are suffering. We know that staff are sometimes suffering, and we have to do whatever we can to erase that.
So take me back then to this connection to domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and how that dismantling the system of white supremacy also helps us in that area. If we could just tie that back together.
Yeah. So when we look at how white supremacy has laid the foundation for a lot of systems in our country, so how it has laid the system for the carceral, or laid the foundation for the carceral system, the law enforcement system, child protective services, a lot of service industries have roots in this belief that we have to protect certain people and not others. The ways in which then certain laws have been passed over time, certain policies and practices over time that have well-meaning intentions have often had an inadvertent devastation caused in different communities, right? So how different crime laws that required things like mandatory arrests sounds really good on the surface. If the police get called to show up somewhere, someone has to go to jail. That sounds good on the surface. What was actually happening was then certain calls were being forwarded towards communities of color at disproportionate rates. So disproportionately, this was then impacting communities of color. What this also meant was that because someone had to get arrested, oftentimes inadvertently, the victim would wind up being the one arrested and held, because when they were defending themselves, there was a scratch mark left on the perpetrator. And the police looked at that in a way of, oh, well, you did some violence, so you've got to go to jail. So it's looking at things like that as an example of how we establish some of these policies and practices that sound good on the surface, but in actuality, in implementation, have caused harm and were disproportionately used against certain communities of folks, predominantly communities of color, to maintain a system of dominance, power, and control against this group of people.
Why do you think this work is important to do at Vera House, and at the risk of, as you said, the impact that it's having on some people saying, I can't do this, I don't want to do this, this is too much work for me to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we do not make radical changes, then we're not going to see radical results. We can get by with doing the bare minimum, but we know that the bare minimum is not the standard at which we will accept. We will not, do justice for the world if we are just standing by and not taking a stance, not acknowledging the reality of a situation, not listening to and hearing survivors and believing survivors in the same way that we are listening to, hearing, and believing people of color who have been saying this for decades, that this is their lived experience within systems. We need to listen to that. We need to honor that in the same way that we say we believe survivors. We need to believe folks of color and other marginalized folks of their experiences with these systems, because survivors and victims are not all just straight white women, right? That we are serving male survivors, we are serving queer and trans survivors, we're serving survivors of color, and their experiences have not been listened to in the same way. So when they are saying this doesn't work for us, we have to make a change, because it's not about Chris Kosakowski, campus team coordinator. It's not about me, what I want, what I need. It's about the people that I'm serving, the people that I'm working with.
Are there other ways that this shows up in the work that y'all do, that y'all do at Vera House, in terms of the impact of now considering anti-racism and anti-oppression work? How's that showing up? How is that being managed?
I think we've been having really critical conversations. We've been really holding each other accountable. We've been really trying to not just do performative, yeah, we're woke, we're Vera House, we're for the cause. We're really looking at how day-to-day experiences are showing up. So when we're in a team meeting and someone says something that's problematic and no one calls them out, we're not doing what we're saying we're supposed to be doing. Part of the journey has also been developing a number of different groups in our agency. So we have different caucuses for folks to kind of filter into to do some of this work. So I'm very fortunate that I get to serve as one of the co-chairs with our co-executive director, Angela Douglas, of our Caucus of Color. That is a group that has come together that is made up of staff of color to talk about their experiences here at the agency, their work here at the agency, and focus on acknowledging the things that have been going on for us, and focusing on healing and growth in regards to racial trauma. There's also been created a white caucus for white staff to acknowledge and address ways in which they've participated in these systems of harm and working on addressing those things. And the third piece that we've created is a collective group of staff across the agency that is focused on looking at what the needs are and looking at what changes need to happen. And that means the changes outside of the agency. So doing some advocacy work in regards to changing systemic issues outside of Vera House, and also looking at our internal policies, practices, hiring decisions, interview questions, supervision styles, a lot of different key pieces of the agency that we need to address.
Yeah, and looping that all back, the whole point of this is to dismantle, as you describe, the systems that dominate, that create power, control, and that marginalize. And how do we create a world free of violence and abuse that opposes all systems that
Right.
seek to oppress? And that's part of domestic violence, sexual assault, and other forms of abuse prevention, as we look at how this also connects to other forms of violence, including community violence. So that's some heavy work, Chris.
Keeps me busy, but I think if I can say one last thing, I think to do this work, it starts with authenticity. It starts with having a conversation, being open to a conversation, and having a real, honest dialogue. You cannot have any action without that as the foundation. So the first part is opening the door and raising that awareness, having that conversation to be able to take action and do some true good work for the world.
All right. And that work continues at Vera House. By the way, if you are in need of support, we have a 24-hour, we have a 24-hour support line. You can call 315-468-3260 to get support even now as you're in this conversation. If something has triggered you around the issues of domestic violence, sexual assault, and other forms of abuse. And go ahead, Chris.
And if you're not comfortable using the phone, we also have our web chat service. So if you are in a situation and you would prefer to text with a person, it's a live person. That is not 24/7. It's from 8:30 a.m. to 9 p.m. You can go to www.verahouse.org and chat with a live person in that same way.
Up to 9 p.m. Eastern time. And every conversation that we have with you is confidential. So just so you know, nobody has to know, nobody will know. And if you call and somebody asks us if we call, we cannot confirm or deny that you call. So I'm just letting you know that we're here to support you. Chris Kosakowski, Campus Project Coordinator, co-chair of the Caucus of Color at Vera House. Thank you for coming on and sharing some very important work that Vera House is doing as we close out Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
Thank you so much, George. Thanks for doing the work too.
Inspiration for the Nation.